Witcher 3 turned 10 years old in 2025, and when it released, it gave us an insight into a character that is arguably one of the most important, especially when it comes to the political landscape of the continent. His story has been explored quite a lot within the books, and for a good portion of his life, he was pretty quiet, hidden away biding his time before he rose again and raised an army so big that half, if not all of the continent is scared of seeing their banners. Known in his native tongue as the white flame dancing on the barrows of his enemies, Emhyr Var Emreis is the emperor of the brutal southern country of Nilfgaard, and also father to the child of elder blood, Ciri. Ruling under his iron fist, his ambition is to put everyone under the Nilfgaardian rule, as he is quoted as saying the North shall tuck tail and beg for mercy. That is its destiny. And with it, he is also on a quest to retrieve Ciri and claim her for his own once again. But how did Emhyr get to where he is today? What did he get up to before the events of Witcher 3? How did he lose track of Ciri? And how did he start the Northern Wars? So in today's episode, we will be exploring the full story of the Nilfgaardian Emperor and his transformation into someone everyone, bar a few witches, completely fears. This is the story of the Nilfgaardians' brutal emperor, Emhyr Var Emreis. When Emhyr was growing up, his father of the time, the Emperor of Nilfgaard, known as Fergus Var Emreis, oversaw everything within their lands. Fergus was incredibly unique as an emperor, and actually introduced an absolute gender equality into the empire's military, with no one having any exceptions. This also went into their citadel prison, where males and females located there could go on to share cells together, once again with no real exceptions. Other policies he put into place were with Colvir and Pulvis, where he would sign a treaty with the king there, Esteril Thason, that made it so both countries wouldn't support enemies of one another with money or soldiers. However, as more things were put in place, Fergus noticed that people were going against his rule, and conspiracies were spreading throughout Nilfgaard. For a time, he was able to see them off. However, eventually Fergus would promote the man who would go on to eventually end his life after successful expansion missions into nearby lands. This now general of his army would be unnamed, but would eventually go on to be named as the Usurper. Being grabbed by these highly praised warriors, Fergus would go on to be tortured by this usurper as he wanted to grant legitimacy to the coup. Fergus refused, however, and so the usurper had to take a new approach. By this point in time, Emhyr was 13 years of age and had watched his father be taken and imprisoned by this individual. Seeing Emhyr, the usurper summoned a sorcerer named Brathens to capture him and turn him into a humanoid hedgehog form as a somewhat form of joke, as the word of Emhyr in Nilfgaardian meant urchin, an old name for hedgehog. But this was also to put pressure on Fergus to give up his role as emperor. But unfortunately, once again, this plan failed, as Fergus once again refused to give up his role, and now not only had the usurper turned Emhyr into a weird hedgehog type being, but he had also murdered Fergus with it. And because of that, there were no more Emreis left to rule the empire, leaving the usurper free to take the throne for himself. As he did so, he also realized that he had no more use for Emhyr, and with it, released him into the woods, sending out dogs to chase him down as well. Doing so, he thought that he wouldn't make it into the next day, and with it, the Emreis family would be wiped out forever. Despite that, Emhyr survived, and whilst out there within the woods, also learned that the sorcerer was pretty inept, as the curse he had been given did not work at night. In fact, at night, he returned back to his human form. Now hiding away from the whole of Nilfgaard, Emhyr called for his loyal friends and supporters to house him during his time of need, and hid within the house of a fellow Nilfgaardian nobleman named Ardal eb Dair, also known as the Blue Fox. Whilst living here, he would also go on to meet with an astrologer of Zarthethios, who would go on to convince Emhyr that there was in fact a cure for his curse, but it existed in the north, more specifically in the city of Sintra, as he was quoted as saying the cure was beyond the Marnadal steppes. With that, Emhyr knew where he was to go, and left to go up to the north, venturing forward to the city of Sintra. It took a long while before Emhyr reached the north, and along his travels changed his alias to Dunny, Urcheon of Erlenwald. This title was put on him because of an extremely significant event which helped shape the whole of his future. Here within Erlenwald in 1237, Emhyr would find himself within the Sintra forest region and would run into an extremely injured individual who would turn out to be King Rognar, the then king of Sintra, who was in need of serious aid after a hunting incident went wrong. Lifting him up from the gully he had found himself within, Emhyr, or Dunny now, would be rewarded for his generosity and would be enacted with the law of surprise, which promised him whatever he had left at home without knowing or expecting it. 14 years later, Dunny met with who he would eventually claim to be his reward from the law of surprise, that being the young princess of Sintra, Pavetta, who was born a year after Dunny saved King Rognar. Now a year later, after secretly seeing Pavetta behind his parents' back, Dunny would present himself before Queen Calanthe, Pavetta's mother, during Pavetta's 15th birthday, and when she was being presented with all of her suitors from Sintra. Knowing full well none of the suitors would do, it was clear that Pavetta and Dunny had fallen in love over the past year, and now this was his opportunity to claim her as his own, stating that he had the law of surprise, and the day she was born, he enabled that law and claimed Pavetta as his to keep forever. And here on this birthday celebration, he was going to come to claim what was his. Revealing his true intentions to all, a major dispute kicked off as Calanthe refused to accept that her daughter was going to be given away to this man who had been promised something by her now dead husband. As the exchange went on for some time, Calanthe was eventually able to fool Dunny and get him to remove his helmet before midnight struck, which also allowed all to see his monstrous form. This did not matter for Pavetta, who was still fully on Dunny's side. Calanthe then got even more irritated by this whole situation and sent her vassals to attack Dunny along with all of the other suitors. Luckily for Dunny, he would get the help from the Witcher of Geralt, who was also at the feast at the time, as well as the druid known as Musak or Ermion, as they would both go on to defend him. As the scuffle continued, Dunny would eventually go on to be stabbed by one of the suitors, which triggered an outburst of horror from Pavetta as she would unleash her sorceress abilities, as furniture and people would be sent flying around the room. Not only that, but she also went on to threaten everyone, saying she would make the castle collapse if any further harm came to him. Geralt, seeing the power Pavetta had just unleashed on the guests, helped Musak silence her, and soon after that, midnight had come about, meaning Dunny had now transformed back into his human form, telling everyone that he was the Prince of Maecht, a new province in Nilfgaard, and he was the son of Akaspark, a legendary figure, which would later of course turn out to be completely false. Seeing this transformation and with everyone now calming down, Calanthe eventually gave her approval for Dunny and Pavetta to be married, and with the help of Geralt, his curse would also be lifted and he could return to being human all of the time. Geralt would be thanked for his help in all of this, but at the same time, they would also go on to find that Pavetta during this time was pregnant and Dunny was confirmed to be the father. When that child was born, they would go on to name her Cirilla. Located at Sintra, it was now the 1250s, and Ciri had been born into their kingdom. During this time, Dunny would receive a visitor, a sorcerer named Vilgefortz, who pledged himself as an ally to Sintra, who really wanted to make a name for himself, acquire wealth and power, knowing full well that Dunny or Emhyr was the one who could give it all to him. As the two got talking, Vilgefortz would go on to tell him about a horrifying prophecy named the White Frost, which would be a phenomenon that would go on to completely freeze over the whole of a planet, something that even the most powerful mages could not slow down, and if it were to take hold of the planet, its end would be inevitable. No one really knows what it is, be it a natural force, a malevolent entity, or something unimaginable, but regardless, the prophecy had now been told to Emhyr, and this was the catalyst for him to return back to his homeland and reclaim what was taken from him, now with his daughter of Ciri next to him. This was because the prophecy had also said the world could only be saved by an offspring of the Elder Bloods, known as the Swallow, and as Ciri possessed Elder Blood, she was the key to all of this, and Emhyr needed her to complete the prophecy. Calanthe had been keeping an eye on Dunny ever since he revealed himself at the celebration banquet, and watched as he plotted on escaping Sintra with Vilgefortz without being seen. Here they planned the death of Emhyr, Ciri and Pavetta as they would deliberately sink their ship, making it look like they had died on it. However, Vilgefortz would save them and allow them to never be tracked down ever again. That said, Emhyr forgot to take into account the thoughts and feelings of Pavetta as she hated what her husband had planned. land and instead tried to smuggle Ciri out of the ship before anything could happen. This was going to lead to a scuffle between the married couple as Emhyr would push Pavetta off of the ship, leading to her actually drowning at sea. With that, Vilgefortz teleported the ship away from the raging maelstrom, allowing Emhyr to be the only remaining survivor. Despite being the one that killed Pavetta, he was absolutely distraught at what he had done, despite the fact that since he had met her, he had no real feelings for her. But now that all of that had happened, Dany was officially dead to everyone, and Emhyr could venture back to his homeland and finally stand up to the man who had cursed him and killed his father, that of course being the usurper. And as he succeeded doing that, he would go on to reward the astrologer who helped guide him to the north back as a teenager, rewarding him with his own tower in the capital city, praising him for his services. As the political struggle looked like it was coming to an end, Emhyr would have all of his political enemies killed, and with their deaths had their gravestones pave his ballroom, which earned him the new nickname of the White Flame dancing on the barrows of his enemies. Now in complete control of the Nilfgaard throne, Emhyr looked outward and wanted to start his empire's full-on expansion in the year of 1263, triggering what was known as the First Nilfgaard-Nordling War. Here, Emhyr's forces came head-to-head with the Cintran army at the Mardinal Stairs, with their army being led by Calanthe. It was quite clear that this attack was to also capture Ciri, who was still being held within the castle here. But as the siege went ahead, Ciri managed to escape the castle and looked to be free from him once again. However, Emhyr had gone on to send for one of his best agents to specifically locate Ciri, named Cahir, and as she escaped the castle, was going to find her and capture her, ruining her escape plans. With the fall of Cintra, Emhyr continued on his campaign against the north and was extremely successful. However, that all came to a halt at the Second Battle of Sodden Hill, where the forces located here, including a handful of sorceresses, were able to drive back the Nilfgaardian forces and stop them from progressing any further into the north of the continent. With this defeat, the First Nilfgaard-Nordling War came to an end, and Emperor Emhyr had officially been defeated. This did not sit well with him at all, as you can imagine, and as a response to this defeat, Emhyr had all of the commanders who failed him at Sodden either executed or simply replaced by younger and more determined officials who were ready to prove themselves in a war, as Emhyr set forward his plans to launch the attack again and start the Second Northern War. Before he launched that war, Emhyr would receive a report from his Field Marshal Menno Cohorn that all of the rulers of the north, including Vizimir II of Redania and Foltest of Temeria, had launched a secret council within a castle in Hague, Eärden. Knowing this, Emhyr told Cohorn to spread that information amongst all of the mages and members of the chapter of wizards and sorcerers. At that same time, he also wanted Cohorn to deal with the rebellion happening within Cintra, and once it was completed, move to Dol Angra and to not be provoked by the White Queen, Neve of Lyria and Rivia, and King Demavend of Eärden, who wanted Nilfgaard to launch their attacks. But Emhyr made it very clear that they were only to attack when he gave the permission. When this information was given over, a messenger went on to report to Emhyr that they had successfully suppressed the rebellion in Cintra, and with it had captured their leader, Duke Wildhelm of Ater. Emhyr was thrilled by this news, as he was going to order the public spectacular execution of him to make sure it frightened anyone who held the same views as him and wanted to follow in suit. Once he was executed, Cohorn, who was present at the time, was made governor of Cintra and the proxy for the Emperor. Whilst Emhyr finalized all of this, he was getting frustrated that he had not heard back from one of his incredibly powerful mages known as Rions, who had not reported back any of his findings from up north. Knowing he had to do something, he would turn yet again to Cohorn to get his mages to set up a telecommunication link to Redania, and with it, Rions. And once they got through to him, would order him to immediately dispose of the Witcher Geralt whilst leaving the sorceress Yennefer untouched. Despite saving Emhyr all those years ago, Geralt was seen as a major threat to him. He did not hold on to precious memories of friendship or anything like that. Emhyr wanted power, and Geralt possessed Ciri due to his law of surprise, and seeing him bond with his daughter was horrifying. If Geralt wanted to, he could use the power of Ciri and become far more important and powerful than Emhyr, and that terrified him. So in an act of envy to some extent, Geralt needed removing from the picture, regardless of what he had done for Emhyr. At the same time, Emhyr would meet with a count known as Cahir, the man who was responsible for capturing Ciri during the First Northern War. However, whilst extracting her, went to sleep one night only to find she had escaped his clutches, something Emhyr hadn't forgiven him for. Due to this, he had to pay the price and owed the Emperor a major favour, and with it offered him a chance for redemption. Together with Cohorn, these two would be tasked with one of the most vital missions to date, and that was to organise the event known as the Thanid Coup. Knowing full well that all of the leaders of the North as well as the sorcerers and sorceresses would be located on Thanid Island, including Ciri as well, this would be Cahir's chance to capture her once again. As the coup went ahead, however, Cahir would ultimately fail once again, as Ciri would go on to escape through the Benevent portal located at the top of the tower on Thanid Island. Not only did Emhyr have to deal with that terrible news, but he also had found out that after all of this time, Vilgefortz had betrayed him, and ultimately, he had never been on the Emperor's side. He had just been playing him at his own game, and with that took steps further and ordered for Ciri, Vilgefortz and Cahir to be sought out by his secret service. During this search, a half-elf named Shiru would go on to bring him who he thought was Ciri. However, as soon as Emhyr saw her, realised he had been given an imposter. Regardless of this fact, Emhyr pretended to believe it and keep her by his side, whilst his secret service continued to look for the real Ciri, all whilst the war that was ongoing was going in Nilfgaardians' favour. That said, a man known as Stefan Skellen, who had been originally tasked with finding Ciri, had also turned his back on the Emperor and launched a coup in Nilfgaard itself. Despite dealing with that, Emhyr would eventually go on to locate not just Vilgefortz, but Ciri as well, who were located at Stigger Castle, the old home of the House of the Cat Witcher School. But it wasn't just him who arrived on the scene to capture them. Geralt also showed up on the scene to confront them. Geralt had been surprised by what he had seen. He quickly realised that Emhyr and Dunny were merely two names for the same person, and that the man responsible for all of the death and destruction in the north was the same man he saved during Pavetta's birthday celebration. As the two met up, Emhyr told Geralt everything about his plans to marry Ciri and have a child with her to make sure the prophecy came true and they could stop the White Frost with a child from the Elder Blood. Hearing all of this, Geralt was horrified about these plans, thinking that Emhyr was utterly sick of wanting to have a child with Ciri just because of some prophecy, calling him out as a monster. As the meeting came to an end, Geralt, Yennefer and Ciri were allowed to be together for a bit before Emhyr's plans went ahead. However, in a sudden change of events, whilst out on the road, Emhyr realised that his plans were indeed monstrous like Geralt had told him, and instead of going forward with it, let his daughter leave without revealing to her his true identity, allowing her to go back to Geralt and Yennefer. Whilst all of that was going on, the most decisive battle of the Second War was happening over at Brenna, where the compounded northern forces under the leadership of Constable Jan Natalis would hit back against Nilfgaard and ultimately destroy them. However, despite that loss, the Empire would still win the war as a whole, as every bit of land south of Yaruga, which included Sintra, were left under the banner of the Golden Sun. To see the end of the war, Emperor Emhyr would go on to marry the false Ciri that Shiru had brought to him as he grew to love her, and as that happened, a treaty was signed within the capital of the conquered country, which became known as the Peace of Sintra, conducted mainly thanks to the persuasive skills of the Lodge of Sorceresses, which included Philippa Eilhart, Francesca Finderbear, Margarita Lo Antil, Triss Merigold, and Kira Metz. The year was now 1271, and a mysterious group of Witcher hunters would go on to kill both Demoven III and Foltest. As a result of this, Geralt would be the one accused of Foltest's murder due to his involvement in the continent's politics. The group responsible, however, was known as the Kingslayers and were actually a part of the School of the Viper, which was led by Letho of Gullet. As Geralt journeyed around, he would eventually come to meet with Letho, only to find that he was backed by the Emperor, as Emhyr had fully funded these attacks in an attempt to destabilize the northern kingdoms once again, and then eventually invade them all over again. Money would only go so far in terms of incentivizing Letho. However, the Emperor promised him his own land within Emhyr's empire where witches could be free to live without any hatred or prejudice that they suffer on a day-to-day basis. This of course was a complete lie, as Emhyr would have never given Letho this land. He just needed him to do the work before he could stab him in the back. Thanks to Letho's actions, Emhyr was able able to send his troops across the Yaruga for the third time, and because of how rattled the northern kingdoms had become, it didn't take them long at all before the Nilfgaard troops conquered Temeria, Aedirn, Lyria and Rivia, as well as Cadwen up to the source of the Lixella. After this new invasion, the rest of Emhyr's enemies would go on to join up under the new leadership of King Radovid V of Redania, who along with the Redanians, Temerians, Aedirns, Cadwins and others were able to stop the Nilfgaardian army on the Pontar River. Despite that, Emhyr was certain that this war was going to be finished quickly and already started to name himself as the ruler of the north and the south. But despite what he had achieved, this whole war was not going down well with the Nilfgaard proper, which led to trade corporations as well as other nobles to start plotting Emhyr's downfall. But that only motivated Emhyr even further, as he would go on to make sure that he had a swift victory to make sure his subjects did not rebel against him. Knowing his time was limited as the emperor, he set into play a new plan of putting his daughter, the real Ciri, on the throne and having her as his successor. However, that would require finding her once again, and for that he needed outside assistance. He had already captured Yennefer as well as other witches of the Viper School, but he also needed the assistance of Geralt of Rivia, and with that offered them both a reward for if they were to find Ciri once again. After a long and grueling journey, with Geralt venturing over vast areas of the continent, even venturing over to Skellige, the famous witcher would eventually find Ciri once again. But there would be a catch. As soon as he were to get to her, the Wild Hunt would go on to attack, as they would also seek out Ciri to capture her and use her to save them from the White Frost prophecy, which had already taken their homeland. Knowing he was going to need help against the leader of the Wild Hunt, Eredin, Geralt sought out Emhyr and told him he needed to know about the situation and that he needed to lure the Wild Hunt to Kaer Morhen and fight them there. Hearing this plan, Emhyr agreed to lend Geralt his troops to help with the battle, but only if Morvan Verhoris led the troops in charge. Knowing what this meant for his plan, Geralt immediately declined and left the meeting, dealing with the Wild Hunt themselves. Seeing off that first battle at Kaer Morhen, losing the dearly beloved Witcher of Vesemir in the process, a second battle would go ahead on the shores of Undvik, as Geralt would have a final standoff against the Wild Hunt commanders. Unfortunately for Geralt, Nilfgaard would be a part of this regardless of Geralt's needs, as he would have to fight alongside them in one of the biggest battles seen, with the Nilfgaardian forces being run by Duke Var Atre. It's unsure exactly what happened to Emperor Emhyr Var Emreis during this battle. Ultimately, he is destined to have three fates. If Radovid or Dijkstra ruled the north, Emhyr would go on to be assassinated by internal conspirators for losing the war, going to show how unpopular he had become by the end for plunging the empire into endless conflicts. However, if Radovid and Dijkstra were killed during the process, Emhyr would go on to take over the entire north, and with it would also wipe out all of those who went against him. The final one would be if he eventually got to meet up with Ciri, and if this meeting did happen, Emhyr would ultimately abdicate the throne to her, and the Nilfgaardian Empire would continue on under his bloodline. It's most likely that the latter is not the canon ending for Emhyr, considering where Ciri is by Witcher 4. However, it's unsure if Nilfgaard has won the war or not. Based on where the next location is, being a place many people have escaped to due to Nilfgaard's march, it could be that they did win the war, and everywhere south of here is now under the Golden Sun banner. But I guess that is something we will have to wait for within the next game. But what is confirmed is that by 1301, Emhyr has died and is no longer the ruler of that empire anymore. Who it's in the hands of is unknown, as finding that new ruler was put in the hands of Peter Evertsson by the end of Emhyr's rule. So we'll just have to wait and see what this empire's fate is in the next game. But whatever has happened to Emhyr, his legacy will live forever in the history books, and he will always be remembered as a brutal leader who stopped at nothing to get his way. He has plunged the world into many bloody wars, all to expand his empire, get revenge on past acquaintances, or just to get his daughter back for a sick plan. And almost all of the time, it has worked. And you could argue that if it wasn't for Emhyr, Geralt wouldn't have been able to get to Ciri and overthrow the Wild Hunt on their quest to get her. But regardless, Emhyr is a great character. A terrifying and horrible one, but a great one nonetheless. And hopefully we get another one similar going forward in this franchise. But for now, this has been the story behind Nilfgaard's brutal emperor, Emhyr Var Emreis. I want to say a big thanks for watching this video once again, and do let me know if you'd like to see more Witcher videos and what topics you'd like to see in them. Big thanks to my patrons for their endless support, including my small fishes, my big fishes, Noxvox, Ben Chance, Jono, This Mind of Mine, and Anthony Bonfiglio, my YouTube channel Wise Ones, Sith Lord 906, Video Gamer 75, and Planet Nanotarium, my Megalodons, Sinus and Hazy Thoughts, and my incredible Starfish Nanohertz. But with that all said, thanks so much for watching again, and I shall see you all in the next one. Cheers.
A winding, weaving fate to which we both atone. You flee, my dream come